want to try to proceed so that we keep a narrative continuity, because otherwise, and this is a real problem in discussion classes, right? It's very easy to lose track. Things come from all over the place, and at the end you can feel like, so what really happened? And I don't want you to leave the entire semester thinking, what was that about? So let's try to kind of move in a bit of order, though still with lots of flexibility. So one of the reasons, not the only one, maybe not the best one, but an important one, to look at Plato on these questions is in part because, well, he's the first one to write seriously about them. That is, to make love of various kinds a topic of philosophical inquiry. And then, since he was the first, and he wrote these two great philosophical and literary masterpieces about it, his thought about it has shaped a huge amount of the rest of the discussion. So there's a lot of reason to read these two dialogues, apart from their intrinsic interest. But there's another reason why I think it's important. So I want you to do a little thought experiment. I'm not going to ask you to state the results of it. I'm just going to ask you to do it. So whatever your sexual proclivities are, and you think of yourself as heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, asexual, whatever your sexual orientation, you take it to be. Right? I want you to ask yourself whether you think you could have had another one. So do you, when you think about it, do you think, this was just given to me as my sexual orientation, and there is just a fact about me like my hair color or my gender or whatever? Or do you think that it's not like that? And let me give a different one. Think about your gender and ask, do I think I could have had another one? How deep a fact about me do I think my gender is? That is, so do I think, oh, I could easily have been. Think of a third one. Think about your race and ask yourself whether you think you could have had a different race. So the reason to pick all those, we have very interesting, different intuitions about these. Right? And some people think, for example, that it's quite possible to become transgendered, right? They don't think that your gender is a fixed fact about you. But it's very interesting how we feel. And I would think that gender, I don't know how deep a fact about one gender is, but I think it's fairly deep, right? Deeper, say, than eye color. Right? Now, what about race? Could you become transracial? So I might say, I might introduce myself as follows. Hi, I'm David. I present as male and as white. But actually, I'm black and female. Now, you could have two thoughts. You might think about the female part. Oh, that could be true. But that's what we think. Yeah, look, I'm a female stuck in a male body. That would be the way you put that, right? But notice that if I said that I was black, though I present as white, you might think, oh, maybe there's a distant black ancestor. But otherwise, I think you'd create a furor if you decided that. I mean, suppose, for example, the university is trying to hire lots of so-called minorities into the philosophy department, right? And I'm up for a job, and here I am, a guy a being who presents as a white male. And I think that if I were a female, though, I'd get the job in a heartbeat. So think if I said, well, really, I am a black female. It's just that I present as a white male. I think lots of people would have more problem with race than they would with the gender, even though I think that race is a much shallower aspect of us than gender, in part because I think races are just the result of a whole lot of accidents. Right? We don't all descend from Adam and Eve, but we all have the same female mitochondrial DNA, so I suspect that once upon a time, we're all just one big race. It's an interesting fact, and I just want to present it. So, yeah.
Have you seen the most recent Dave Chappelle Netflix special?
No.
He talks about exactly those things for most of the hour. Yeah, he talks about I don't remember what her name is, but the woman who identified as black.
Yeah, that's a famous, famous guys. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's really curious how we react to this. Now notice though, now suppose I said, okay, so how are we going to explain that fact? So I think that, for example, this is fairly true. But if we were just looking at ourselves from a genetic or biological point of view, we would think that the differences in our sexualities, or our sexual characteristics, were pretty deep facts about us. And that's true about the rest of the animal world, too. The males and the females are pretty identifiable, and they have very different biological roles. So we might think, that's fairly deep. But if I said, well, you know, look, it's a bit like, do you think that breeds of dog is a very deep fact about a dog? Well, it's a wire-haired fox terrier instead of Pekingese. You might think, yes, but actually if we just let all the dogs interbreed, you get the same kind of yellowish brown, mud-colored terrier type, the kinds you find wandering the streets of South American cities, right? Give them a chance to interbreed. We've had to selectively breed those things, but they all come from the same canine stock. I think the same is true about us. So, and I tell you all of that, and then I say, however, most people, and it seems even very tiny children. So, for example, there was a famous psychological experiment that goes like this. So, you have a little opaque screen, right? And a person who looks like me goes through the box and comes out like me, only black. And even small, tiny children, the earliest stages that we can get, exhibit real shock at that change. So we're suggesting that, in fact, their sensitivity to things like color are pretty early developing and may not be social constructs, right? But other ones, like if I were to go in wearing male clothes and come out wearing female clothes with long hair, there's much less surprise, right? So that's an interesting little bit of, we don't know what to make of it. But let me just tell you one more thing, and then you'll see where all this is going. So if we wanted an explanation for why we think race is deeper than gender, even though all the facts suggest that it's actually rather shallow, how do you think we'd explain that? So if you just reach for an explanation and tell me, why do you think we think that you can't become transracial, though you can become transgendered, even though you would think that it should be pretty easy to explain? Yeah.
I would say that most people would consider things like your gender and your sexual orientation to be more coming from your brain. Like, yes, some of it might be, who knows? Who knows? We don't know if it's genetic. Meanwhile, race, we know, is genetic. Like, yes, my best friend looks very, very, very white. She has, like, a very Cuban grandmother, but stuff like that doesn't, like, she still doesn't say, oh, I'm Cuban. Because
so you flipped it around. I thought I was presenting it the other way, but you're turning it around. I think that genetically, gender or not, so I have to want to distinguish between gender, right, and sex, which is a biological category. So I would have thought that the sex category was deeper, right, because sexual distinctions are very deep, biological and genetically very deep, whereas the race one seems actually very superficial by comparison, right? So in a way, it's sort of like, you know, you might think, you know, if we look at tigers, the difference between male tigers and female tigers, or male lions and female lions, is a much more robust fact about them than all of the other differences in their coloring and the way their size and other things. So I want to ask again to take it that way for a second and say, well, in the case of race, we have a problem, but we don't have it so much in the case of sexuality. Yeah.
I think the question lies in authority, like the authority to say something. Like for my gender, for example, the category is one that which only I know in its essence, unless you're like especially with modern concepts of it, is like I know what I feel. And the
I think you're
category
going
is
for
what I
gender.
feel. Yeah, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so go start with, it's not gender if we might, so we do draw a distinction. With what right is a different question, it may well be that. So we do also talk about transsexuals, that's quite somewhat different. That requires more than being transgendered, right? You can be transgendered, as you say, as a psychological fact. You can say, this is how I identify. If you want to become transsexual, you have to do some surgery and hormonal treatments and so on, if you want to enter that other category. So, but I want you to hold fixed for a second the thought that the sexual differences are deep, right? And then I want you to ask, why do we think that the racial ones are not? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the other side of that is that when it comes to race, for example, who has the authority is the outside. If I'm in a black room, I never see anything for my entire life. Race isn't something that exists. So I can't claim to know what the outside says. It's not within my power. So
you get put in a category,
yes.
and you can't. It's not, you don't have, as with gender, and I guess maybe where you were going, the thought is that, in a sense, it's up to you, and nobody can tell you what your gender is. They can tell you what your sex is, but they can't tell you what your gender is. Whereas in the case of your race, somebody can, so to speak, you're put in that category, and you can't escape it by anything that you want to do. Whether you might want to escape it, as we would say, upward, you want to get into, as people who wanted to pass as white used to do when they weren't in the bad old days. Now you might think, well, it'd be much better to be able to pass as black, right? Because the advantages as a minority might benefit you. So there are all kinds of ways to go. But your thought is, so you want to put it in terms of who puts you in the category. So let me ask a different question. If we go that way and say it is about who, one is about who you are and what's up to you, and the other about is what's not up to you. Here's a different question. So if we go with it's about authority, how are we to explain the authority? Okay, so how does somebody get, or what is it to say about something has an authority to put you in a certain category?
I feel like that's why we have the distinction between someone who may be white passing, or even in the case of Rachel Dolezal, who was, black passing.
Yeah.
But you would never say that that is their race. I feel like part of the authority is your family history, whether or not you're aware of it. If you have never, even if I suddenly look black, no one in my family has ever experienced the sort of prejudice or the racism or any of those shared experiences. Even if in my day-to-day life, if I am black passing, I could feel like I relate to present day black people.
So let me, can I follow that out a tiny bit? So, so one thought of issue is, where does your lineage begin? So when white supremacists, for example, want to say it's very important to be white, the question is, if their lineage goes back all the way to the same family, so we're all on the same family tree, what is a lineage? But you had a different notion of lineage at the same time, which is that, so to speak, whether or not it's okay for you to, having, say, even some black ancestor, to say, I'm black, the issue might be rather about whether you've been a victim of prejudice. Right? So sometimes that is the way we want to do it. Because part of what it is to recognize a minority is to say, you've been oppressed, or you're, and it's not, minority is not about the size of the group. So women are a minority, but there are more women than men in the world. It's not about how many, it's about, are you in a group that can be represented as, in a certain way, right, a subject of oppression. And you might think, well, so there's a very interesting case in philosophy. There's a famous, what? Do you want to say something?
Yes, I do. Because I have
But I'm not ready for you to say.
Yes, you do.
Women are oppressed,
Yeah.
So shut up. Go ahead, yeah.
No, No, there is a piece of evidence that
A
race
piece
is
of evidence about what?
that race is very artificial. So a piece of evidence comes from Russia, and if you think of Russians, you think of white hair
Yeah.
and blue eyes, and that's what they are. And then you ask them, and who's your favorite or national poet? And they say Pushkin, and you say what? Because Pushkin comes from the African family. So, and he's been
Yeah.
the national poet forever, and I'm afraid he's going to stay the national poet forever.
Yeah, he was
So-
really Russian, though. He
Ah,
just
he
presented
actually
us.
no. He looked.
Yeah.
He looked.
Yeah.
No, his grandparents were.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that just.
Well, thank you. Now can I get back to the damn thing I was saying?
Sorry, David.
Which I've forgotten now, as you distracted me with Pushkin. What was I talking about? Yes, famous case, yeah. So this is very like your Pushkin case, only it's flipped. There was a famous American philosopher, a philosopher currently in America, who's the best American, best philosophy program in the world, which happens to be at NYU right now. And his name is Anthony Appiah, and he's African, black African. He is born in Africa. He's also the son of a prince, and has gone to went to Eton and Oxford, and speaks with a beautiful British accent, and has always had wealth and power. And he's hired as a minority at the top universities. And you might think, there's something wrong with that. I mean, it seems to get things mixed up. It seems to mix up his race with his minority status, as if one is just a guide to the other. Whereas you want to think these are just roughly correlated, right? It so happens that the privilege belongs with the pale faces and the non-privileged with the darker faces, but there are plenty of exceptions, right? So he is obviously, from a class point of view, a representative of black experience. He's got to be one of the worst examples you could pick. Right? So that's so when we think about why it's important, for example, to have minority representations in universities, part of that is about the importance of different kinds of experience bases. So people are coming from different lived experiences and bringing the wealth of that to the university. But if we thought, well, we could just hire all, and we were hiring minorities, we could hire only people like Anthony Appiah, that would seem to undercut the whole point of minority representation. We're not interested in the rainbow, right? That we should have a multicolored student and faculty population, right? Unless that correlates with a whole set of other factors.
And what I did want to say though is, you said like breadth of lived experience, which I think is deeply informed by one's class.
Can be, yeah, I agree with that.
There's an incredibly troubling correlation between class and race, at least in America.
I exactly agree with that. That's in a way just what I said. Yeah, I agree with you completely. So, but these are rough correlations. They're not identities. So in fact, curiously, as you know, one of the things that we tend to want to be very silent about in America, especially, is class. Yeah. So we don't like the idea that we're actually hiring people with different class backgrounds, because in America, a big part of it is denial of the reality of class. Even though, of course, every day we recognize that there's a growing and deepening and worrying two-class system between the very rich and, everybody who's outside of it. Yeah.
I think that pretty much sums up why transracialism just seems more problematic. Because with gender, for example, there's gender independent from sex. And like, if I'm missing something else, please point it out.
Yeah.
But I feel like those are the two factors, and you can identify as a different gender because it's an identity separate from biology. But then with race, you're born with a color, and there's culture, the correlation of class, the expectation of social roles, and there's just a lot more mess going on. So to say that you're transracial kind of assumes that you have an understanding of all of those factors that, like, assumedly nobody really can unless they are that identity.
Yeah, I think it does seem to me that there's a little bit of truth in that, but it's scary how readily we can be. So take the Hutus and the Tutsis. the Hutus and the Rwanda massacre of the Hutus killed the Tutsis, right? And this was an entirely Belgian colonial invention. They simply selected some group, tall, all from the same, initially the same race. There were no racial divisions. They just selected some that looked more to them, more European, and they gave them certain kinds of privileges, and they taught them to look down on people who looked a little bit differently, and then, you know, one group slaughtered the other with clubs, right? You know, so notice that it's very, you don't have to pick color, and it may not even be a readily discernible difference. It might be completely shallow. It might be very difficult to tell. Are you a or a B, right? And in South Africa, where there are all kinds of different castes, there was a remarkable set of discussions about how do you tell who's a, right? And so I think the fact of startling differences like color shouldn't occlude, you know, shouldn't disguise the fact that from lots of people, for example, in America who say they're white, right? So I think it's fair, right? Are Semitic people white? As you start moving away, so if we move from you would be an ideal, right? So the Nordic, blonde, pale, blue eyes, as we move from that down, we don't just suddenly cross over into dark-haired, dark-skinned people. We discover that there are all kinds of colors in between, and at various times have been put in one category or another, right? Jews, for example, are they white? Some people think, no, they're not white. It doesn't matter what color they are, they're not in the privileged class. So it's a funny stuff. Okay, so now let's go back to the main question. So I asked you to do a little thought experiment, right? And I don't want to hear the results of the thought experiment, but I want to now present you with a startling fact. So, and that's the startling fact that the symposium puts on the table. Because the way that the Greeks, ancient Greeks, organized their sexual lives is completely different from the way that we do. And so, for example, when you were a pubescent boy, but your beard had not yet grown, so roughly, 12, 13, but between then and, say, 17, 18, puberty comes much earlier now that our diets are better, but that was fairly late arrival. From in that period, you were the object, culturally accepted object of older male sexual desire. So the normal thing is you would become the boyfriend or the eromenos of an older male who would court you in the way that men court women, or used to anyway, in our country, gifts, love poems, little things, pining outside the door, running after, chasing, turning up everywhere the boy was, until finally the boy would sort of succumb to just exactly what is an interesting question. But that was the ritual. It was really, everybody went through it. And then those boys, when their beard grew, became, as we would say, regular men. They married, not children. They weren't, by the fact that they had these experiences, they weren't put in a class. Everyone, especially if the aristocratic, relatively aristocratic class, all went through this. And the boy, like with Victorian women, the boy was not supposed to enjoy giving his favors, so he wasn't supposed to get pleasure out of the sex that they had. He was supposed to sort of grin and bear it, in part because this was thought to be how you become a man. You become a man by associating in this way with somebody who's already a man. And in many tribes, we know that this already exists, right? You have to get in contact with sort of the male spirit characterized or carried in the semen before you can become a man yourself. As this is the way it happened. And if you see Kuros figures, you've seen many of them, young boys standing like this, with braided hair, right? Looking impassive. If you look up Kuros, K-O-U-R-O-S, and Google it, you'll find lots of pictures. And the thought was, and there are many paintings on pots, where what you see is, the boy like this, right, standing, and now I want you to imagine that he's transparent, so you can see through him. And the older male is crouched over him sort of like this, usually bigger, holding him like this, and the thought is that they're having a kind of sexual intercourse, but it's, as they say, intracrural, between the thighs, so the male is rubbing himself between the thighs and producing an ejaculation that way for him. Probably, though, that's nicer than, or how do we put it, prettier than the reality, which is that it was probably anal penetration. That's what all the comedies tell us. So the boy has had anal sex with older males, and that was a norm. And then, as soon as their beard grew back, they went to reversing polarities. And now they had younger boys as boyfriends, and that was where the sort of main erotic thrust was. They had wives for family and producing children. So one of the ancient texts says, we have boys for pleasure and women for the production of legitimate children. Marriages were arranged, complex set of rules applying to them. And and that's the background against which we see the symposium, which, as you know, it's all males talking, and they're all talking about what we would think of as homosexual or homoerotic love. They're talking about the love of two men. They're not talking about the love of a man and a woman, or two women. So the thought is, if I'd been brought up there, how would I be? Now, let me analogize that to a different question, a very deep one, I think, in the philosophy of religion, which is, as soon as you discover that there are other religions, which you do pretty early, I mean, especially if you live in a multi-religious society like ours. If you grew up in one that was just mono-religious, right, you might not know. You might not know everybody does, like, everybody does what we do because you live around them, that's what everybody did. But here we recognize very early on that, we go to one church, our neighbors go to another lot of neighbors don't go to a third, a fourth goes to the synagogue, another, right? That's, right. So now there's a real thought. If you think that your religion is the true one, and most people do, right? If they have a religion, they think, yeah, mine's the right one. That was a question, right? But if I'd been brought up next door by them, I'd be one of them. And that raises a question, right, of how robust, or what, so I put it this way, what could the authority be then for claiming that you've got the right one? Because everyone can make that claim, and it seems like on pretty much the same grounds. So this would be the worry that, or the thought that. What you're looking at with your sexuality, in part, not in totality, but in part, is actually itself a social construction. And so you might say, well, we do it one way, we organize our sexual lives one way, but we could have organized them a very different way, and if we had, we would now, when we did the little thought experiment that you did, we'd get different results, even though you would be the same person. Yeah.
I was going to say, I guess this is what you're talking about, because it is a social construct, that we that we organize it in our minds with pleasure, like the connection between our sexual orientation and pleasure.
Yeah.
For example, those young boys, you said they're supposed to like Britney Barrett, they didn't enjoy it.
Well, they weren't supposed to.
Right.
But human beings, being what they are, some probably did. So Alcibiades, who makes an appearance at the end, famous appearance at the end of the symposium, where there was a story in Plutarch that he runs off with his older male, terrible thing, that he's an aristocratic, very important young man. He runs off with his older male lover, and his father sends people and kind of brings him back and hushes it up. So there were risks attached, but clearly some people were finding their pleasures and their erotic selves in this practice.
Right. I guess I was just...
But so your thought was if we went down to the pleasure level, we'd find nature, not culture. Was that the idea?
Right, well, I was thinking if you got up to the nature level, I mean, some of them might enjoy it and find that they have a proclivity towards men, or men and women, or neither. And, but like, you could still categorize it into the categories we have now, depending on what they enjoyed.
So one of the thoughts would be, below the social construct lies a natural fact. So the thought is that what you'll enjoy is fixed. What will happen to you socially is a different question. And I think the thought is that might be true, but it might be false. So take a famous claim that Freud makes. He says women are all polymorphous perverse. That is, they can be gotten to enjoy anything. All it requires is a practice, seduce or male figure. They can be induced to find any, no matter how outlandish the sexual practice might seem. Women are like children, he says, they're sexual. Now, I don't claim he's right. I'm simply saying that when we ask a question like this, we have to be very careful that we're not inventing facts. I'm not accusing you of doing that, of course. But what I'm saying is, very often what we do is, in order to bolster a view that we have, we invent a fact. We say, that's what reality makes us do. And we can see that all over the place, right? So when people say, you know what's wrong with homosexuality? I'll tell you, it's not natural. They're saying, there's a fact out there that shows us something. When you point out that many animals and other species engage in homosexual acts and practices too, they say, oh yeah, but they're just animals. And you think, well, where did nature go in all of this? I mean, now I don't know what we're arguing, right? I see, so it's against human nature. So now we exclude all the other evidence, right? And we say, no, this is definitely. And again, I think what the feeling you have is that in ideology, a claim that's a social one, right, is being backed up by an appeal to a fact. So I would guess, I don't know this for sure, but I'm pretty sure that our pleasures are, what we can get pleasure on is actually fairly flexible. There's quite a lot of room for maneuver, right? So, you know, we could, and part of the reason I think that is that what we find pleasurable is it's self-influenced by social norms. So, for example, take disgust mechanisms in food, right? So, a good friend of mine, a dog lover, went to China, and I said, so how was it in China? Did you like it? And he said, oh, those people eat dogs. That was the end, right? The thought was, you know, that's just a complete, what need I say more? It was like, those people eat children, or those people, you know, commit genocide, or whatever. Sort of, those people are Nazis, right? You don't need to know very much more about them. And I think that's the thought is, yes, but even if we find it horrifying to eat a dog, if we've been brought up eating dogs, cultures select some things as edible and others not. It doesn't coincide with the great scheme of things, with what's really edible. And then we have those kinds of reactions to the things that, we don't eat. I gather that there's an extremely nourishing flour that is now made from ground up cockroaches. If we knew that our flour was ground up cockroaches, we probably wouldn't like it, but evidently it's extremely nutritious, and lots of people do eat bugs. It's not just like in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. We had bugs for lunch, right? They're not, but bugs are a source of protein, and there's a lot of them in the world. So if we could find ways to make them palatable, we'd have solved a lot of our protein problem. Not that I'm planning to rush out to get ground flour made of dried cockroaches. But you see the problem, right? So it can be that part of what it is that I don't try it, or the social norms affect my capacity to enjoy because they make me feel guilty or shamed or whatever. But, yeah.
What I think is interesting, and like it's kind of relates to like your religion example, is that like there's a lot of people out there right now that like now with gay marriage legal, they're like, oh, now gay couples like can raise kids and stuff, right?
Yeah.
So like it's like on one side they're like, oh, like it's like it's not like not natural, but then it's like.
I think I see what. So it's a great New Yorker cartoon about this. There's an elderly couple watching TV, and it says gay marriage is legalized, and the guy says, "Haven't those poor people suffered enough?" Now they can get married, right? Oh man, it's even worse for them. Yeah, and I think that's the sort of worry that you can have is that what we're doing is thinking now you're free to be heterosexually you can be more like a heterosexual, right? And that can be a real threat. That's the thought that I think goes along with when we try to normatize. We do two things. So let me try to give a good example of this. So sometimes when there are outliers, so rebels in a society, right? There are people who go against the norms. So they don't dress the way, they don't eat the things, they put themselves as outsiders. And we think, okay, we've got to bring them in, right? So that's not nice that we exclude them. Let's be more hospitable. Let's find a way to bring them in. We do one thing that can sound just good, right? That's better than excluding them, right? But notice that there is a way you can turn it around and say that it's not just simply good. Here's the great example. Asian American cuisine. So one of the reasons that you might like to go to an Asian restaurant, whatever it is that they'll serve you Asian food and you want to try it. But what happens is, right, when we assimilate, we want to make that more palatable. So there's a kind of compromise. Right? You can come in, but you have to be a little more like us than you were when you were on the outside. So let's take out all the interesting spices and all the things that we don't eat and try to make it a little more like McDonald's, for example. Right? So when I see Asian American cuisine, I never want to eat at those restaurants because you don't, my thought is, you want to experience the other, right? Not a little pale, slightly strange version of yourself. And that's a worry about assimilation, is that when we assimilate, we also destroy differences, whereas in another way to think. So, I'm a little bit, but let me try to put it together with the notion of democracy, right? So sometimes we think that democracy is all about agreement. We should all learn to get on together. But I think a better way to look at it is we should all learn to fight better for the things we really stand for. It shouldn't be that, right, we are compromised. That was the disaster of Bill Clinton and what's his name in England? What would he call the Blair, yes. Just you bad man. That's my. When the war on Iraq, Tony Blair was gone. Should we kill Saddam Hussein? Isn't he a bad man? You think? Well, by that standard, there wouldn't be anybody left in the world taking care of everything. But let's go back. They promoted a third way, right? And the third way was that they would move everything substantially to the right in order to find a middle way and a compromise. And one of the big issues, as you see, is that when you move everything far enough in one direction, you get extremists on the other side, right, who don't want to compromise at all and who keep making you want to making you go even further in that direction. So I think sometimes what we want to say is difference. We have to learn to accept it, not by assimilating it or taking it away or making it more. It's okay to live with people who really don't like you, who disagree with you fundamentally, who think that you're full of shit and that your values are stupid and your thoughts are worse. It's okay as long as the way we're going to disagree is not by killing each other. So we might want to. So those are good. So I'll give you one more example of the ways in which having things brought into the public. So that's another one where, if you remember, or you don't remember, but I do, which was in the 60s when gays began to out themselves. They were no longer wanted to be stigmatized. They wanted to make their sexuality public as a way of getting recognition for them. People would say, hello, I'm Frank, I'm gay, right? And that was part of their no longer wanting to be ashamed of it. And the thought is that that other side, which is bringing things out into the public and having them not be sources of shame and embarrassment and being able to talk openly about them, these are all good things. And they are good things, but they're not unequivocally good things in rather the same way that the outsider or the rebel and the assimilated things. So, because as soon as things become out and visible, they also become controllable. They become subject to other people's thoughts and norms. you start having an influence. You no longer are they your private way of making sense of yourself. Now public norms come to apply. I'll give one example of this, and I'll stop and go back to the symposium. Take genital grooming. I don't imagine that this is something that you've just sort of thought about in the abstract, or maybe in the concrete either, but you know it's a fact, right? And that if we, so one of my, the sons of one of my great friends has a T-shirt, and on the T-shirt are the following little things. What is he portraying? So it just looks like that.
Do you want an actual answer?
Hmm?
Do you want a real answer?
Yeah, of course. Because you all know, right?
Yeah, fashionable ways to shave the female genital.
Yeah. So here's the unshaved pubis. Here's the landing strip, and here's no hair at all. Right? And most people can read that. Right? They look at it and they think, oh yeah, I can read that. I know what that is. And now the thought is, notice that an area that used to be simply private, that is, what you did with it was up to you, has now become subject to fashion and norm. So you no longer sort of are making simply a private decision. You're also situating yourself somewhere on that spectrum. And so norms, which, you know, so having everything be out in the open can seem like an awfully good thing, but it can also be another way in which you become colonized, co-opted, object, you know, subject to ideology, where before you weren't at all. By the way, it used to go the other way. So does anyone know what a merkin is? A merkin is a pubic wig. And so once upon a time, you wanted to have a lot, I'm not kidding, I mean, everything is much stranger than you can imagine. That's the first important fact. Reality exceeds our capacity to imagine anything. But you can try it on the web. Take a random set of words, right? Some sexual ones come in handy if this is what you're looking at, and plug it into the web, and you'll get lots of, everything you can think of has been thought of, and more, and there's a group of people who are really into it. So you can find these are very important facts. So take a young boy growing up in a small rural community who experiences desire for another boy, and who thinks that he's completely weird and really thinks he's sick and doesn't know how to deal with it. Once upon a time, he was completely isolated. He'd have no recourse. Now he's got virtual communities that can help him to understand himself, to make it clear to him that he's not sick or ill or deficient. And that's a great liberation. But then there's another one that comes along with it, right? Which is now the fact that you do think it's all right means that you start, developing connections and making that may or may not be a good thing for you. So anyway, now back to the Greeks, right? So it's a fact. We're talking about the Athenians. We're talking about them in the 15th, 4th centuries. We're talking about mostly an aristocratic elite. But this is how they organized their sexual lives. And in Sparta, with the traditional enemy of Athens, the Spartans organized their sexual lives in even stranger ways. Males and females lived in separate military camps. They were segregated. The women had military training just like the men. They were very athletic and no fun to meet in a dark alley if you happened to be an enemy. Right? They were tough. When couples married, men had to visit their now wives in secret by breaking into the female camp, and if they were caught or was serious, imagine if that was what married life was like, right? I think I'll go visit my wife tonight. Oh, I wonder who's on guard. Right? I mean, you might think birth control might not be nearly as necessary if you're organizing it that way. Okay, so there we are. That's the premise. And I think our reason to look at a dialogue like the symposium is because it does destabilize our ordinary prejudices and ways of thinking, and it asks us to say, and we do it readily, right? We readily read the symposium. I think we readily read it as if we're reading about heterosexual love. We don't. We just blot out the fact that, in a sense, it's not about that. And we proceed to read it as if it's telling us something about the kind of loving we do, even though this might be alien. So we want to get ourselves in the right kind of mood for it. Okay, so that's the, let me stop there now and see if there are issues, questions, yeah.
Is there like a record of there being opposition to that sexual like construct in the way that we have?
Not the kind that we have, in the sense that somebody said that there are things like that's not normal, or the Bible forbids it, or other things like that. It wasn't so much like that. I think it was a different one. It was like the one that in the 18th century in England, you see working class people have for aristocrats, right? So the thought is, those people do that. And there was some sort of reactions that are along those, more like aesthetic, or the thought is those people and us, and we're the ones who don't do that, and they're the ones who do.
To the us, we're the working class? Were the us the working class?
The us were the, yeah. It's of course a little bit anachronistic to talk that way, but roughly speaking, that's right. Yeah, yeah. So people who were not capable of leading a life of leisure because they had land and were wealthy enough to do it. That's what we're dealing with when we look at these elites. Yeah.
I think what's interesting though is that like you're talking about like differences in Sparta and like in Greece and stuff like that. And now like it's more like universal. For example, like if there was a country where this practice of having with little boys, it's like everyone would call it like pedophilia, right?
Would call it
pedophilia.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like,
in fact, we've got a very good example, as you know, in Iraq, Afghanistan. There's a practice of older males having sex with younger boys, and the American armed forces know about this, and now they're being accused of tolerating pedophilia, right, and of closing a blind eye. And from the point of, so you can imagine if we invaded Athens instead, right, of Afghanistan, the thought would be, oh, these disgusting practices, we've got to put a stop to them. That's harmful and wrong. And I think that we're doing two things when we do that, right? One is we're adopting a position of kind of cultural hegemony, right? And sometimes, that's one. And the other is sometimes we do it under the guise of, which may be correct, it may not be that it's simply a guise, that we're protecting young people from harmful practices. So child brides in India are another example. Muslim, there's some interesting stuff in the Quran, as you know, that the Prophet tolerates or what. A woman is ready to marry when she can bear the weight of a man. That can be very young. Menstruation starts very early now because of better food, so very often girls are menstruating at 12, 13. If menstruation is the measure of preparedness for marriage, as many people take it to be, and then you think these people are ready, these women or girls are ready for marriage. That too is something that is being pressed against. Yeah. So that's
like it's just like that, like how religion in that case, like we can still respect, like these people have like different like religious practices. That's fine.
Female genital mutilation is a great. So
right.
Yeah, where there are backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, right, of long established practices that we find in various ways barbaric, and then in some cases we give different kinds of arguments, right? Some are, it's obviously harmful and wrong, and some true that must be true. I think in the case of female genital mutilation, is the fact that it is harmful and wrong an overwhelming reason to forbid it. Smoking is harmful, and in that sense, but maybe it's not harming another person. We try in various ways to find grounds for it. And I want to say that, while some cases seem to me to be fairly clear, that is, I think I know where I stand on them, others seem to me to be much less clear. It's less clear that I know So one of the things I think that we have done, and we're being pressed now in the symposium to think about it, is we're very leery to recognize the sexuality of children, for example. We sort of think that they're innocent, and that that we should preserve them from the filth of sex. And so we bring to it a kind of attitude. So imagine a different one in which we saw children as sexual early, and we began to think about how to non-harmfully introduce them into the realities of sexuality, so that this didn't come as a kind of trauma, and then we limited the kinds of sexual acts they could engage in so that they weren't being physically damaged and other things. That would be a very different thing. If you want to see a case of somebody arguing for us and writing a story about it, Aldous Huxley's novel Island. So Aldous Huxley wrote Brave New World, which is his dystopia, and that's the one everybody knows. But he wrote another one called Island, which is his utopia. And then one of the major things he wants to do is to undercut Christian guilt about sexuality by introducing children to with each other typically in play and so forth, without hiding things from them. It's very interesting to see that, again, there are other ways of doing things. And it's not always obvious that our way of doing it is the best. And so we want to an extent that we are philosophers or engaging in philosophical thinking about this, we want to try to keep our minds open and be swayed by evidence, argument, and facts, and not so much by prejudices or even by our own tastes and feelings. So, yeah.
Yeah, going off of that and our earlier conversation about like just construction in general, there's a really interesting anecdote in Foucault about it's in where he talks about like a story from France or something where this young girl was like led out of town by like the village idiot person and told to masturbate him in the woods away from him. And the general story he tells with this is that like the girl obviously he takes his penis out and like he masturbates him to completion, that kind of thing. But to her it's not a sexual act at all. But if this same event occurred in contemporary society, this would be a horrid child molestation.
Yeah, I think and it's a good example in part because a large part of when we think about harms, we are thinking about how they're experienced, not just about. So sometimes, for example, we look at like damage to a body. So if we're thinking of sadomasochistic practices or whatever, we might look at whip marks and think, oh, that person has been harmed. When we place it into the practice, we don't want to see it in quite that way, even if we still might not find it too attractive ourselves. So I agree, but a big part of it is that your attitudes. So take the young boy in Greece. So I'm going to assume the following to be true, so I won't pick on anybody. Just pretend you're, sort of think of yourself insofar as you do at all. Think about these things, but you think that you're just, as we'd say, a normal little boy who's heterosexual, right? And an older man starts hitting on you. So suppose you're 14 or 15, and you're sitting on a park bench, and an older man comes up and sits next to you. And he begins, obviously, to make delicate but palpable sexual advances. You're going to be really, I'm thinking, pretty shocked, and you're going to run away, right? Everything else being equal. But if you're a Greek little boy in the 5th century, and this is a powerful and attractive man, you might think, gee, how lucky I am. This is right so-and-so. And I could get a Ferrari out of this, man. I mean, if I play my cards right. And moreover, social prestige. And a big part of it, remember, and you'll see this come up in the interlocutors in the dialogue, part of the idea is that it's not just about sex. It's about, so there's a two-way street. The boy learns about manhood and about how to be a man, and learns, as they say, virtue, how to be a Greek man by hanging out with a Greek man who teaches him how to do it. And so it's not wholly a one-way street. And in just the same way, the symposium, which is a sympaticon as a drinking party, and we get the notion of a symposium from people getting together to drink, which is what we are witnessing. And so there's a big argument about the symposium, because the symposium is itself both a social occasion and an educative institution. What do you learn at the symposium? You learn how to drink. You learn how to drink without getting shit-faced. You learn how to drink and see drinking as part of a cultural practice in which inhibitions are lowered and then things can be discussed that it would be difficult to discuss if we were all sober. You see how your older elders and betters do it. And you're absorbed into a practice. And of course, as in this symposium, there were often philosophical discussions, political discussions, discussions about art and literature, that you were absorbed into as part of social life. So not just like there's philosophy and stuff, and that's over there at school. There's politics and so on, and that's in the Agora or in the Pnyx. It's here in our social life, and we learn it by getting together to eat and drink and talk, and we watch each other do it, and we see how people respond to arguments, and as we do in those symposia. So the idea too is that Plato is interested in the symposium, as he is in pretty much every cultural institution, in part because he thinks it should be taken over and made philosophical so that people are actually learning something worthwhile in it and not just wasting their time. So that's another side of our social sexual practices. So if we thought of them differently, we get one more example of this. So there's a huge eroticon, right? That is an encyclopedia of erotic knowledge. It exists, you can get copies of it, but it's also out there in virtual space. You can find out how to do all kinds of things, how to give and get pleasure in all kinds of ways, how to be a better lover, at least in this regard. And sometimes we think of the eroticon as simply like the Kama Sutra or some such thing as this. Here are 89 or 829 things you can do in bed that are much better than what you're currently doing. So why don't you? It's a bit like a cookbook, except it's for bed, right? Have you tried, right? Well, here's how you do that, right? But notice that kind of an approach to sexuality, and I think this is one thing that we're learning ourselves, or relearning, is that tends to segment off the sexual side of our emotional sexual life, the directly sort of genital, pleasure-giving, body contact stuff, from another part, which is how your sexuality is going to be absorbed into your life. So how does your sexuality get absorbed into your social life? And we can see a very obvious problem when we think about how sexual minorities who were excluded could not absorb their sexual life into their social life because they were prevented from declaring it. Right? So if you were Oscar Wilde in the end of the 19th century in England, where sodomy was a crime and you could be put in jail for it, right? The idea that you could have a sexual identity that was definitely homosexual and practicingly so, you could, kiss your boyfriend on the street, so to speak. That was impossible. And part of what we've experienced, I think, is the difficulty of absorbing our sexual lives into the rest of our lives in a way that makes the whole thing kind of go together seamlessly. And part of that is the thought that really it's an eroticon we need, whereas what we need is something else, right? We need, something more like the symposium. How to find our feet with our sexual wishes and desires by talking and discussing them with each other and finding ways to absorb them into the rest of our psychological life. And that's in part what you see going on in the symposium. They're not just talking about it, they're actually socializing themselves into taking and having different attitudes to the ones, to their sexuality from the ones with which they start. Yeah.
I think another interesting thing is kind of barriers or limits you can put on things for example, I think in different states it's the age of consent is like 16.
Yeah.
And others at 17, right?
Yeah.
And like what I think of is like, oh, there's been a bunch of cases like high school teachers.
Yeah.
Having sex with like boys, right?
Yeah.
And like it's like it's also a pleasurable experience for the boy as well.
Yeah.
And then
I'm just thinking, just imagine a typical pubescent 16-year-old high school kid who gets seduced by his quite attractive female teacher. It'd be hard. The problem is the difficulty of seeing that as one in which he's being exploited, though he might be.
But like my thing with this, and then like 2 years later, right? Let's say he has sex with his like college professor.
Yeah.
The college professor, I don't think at that point would be arrested, or I don't think would commit anything.
Not for that. I mean, one of the things we're experiencing, I think that we don't know how this is going to play out. So in a way, we're on the cutting edge, if we can use that expression. It's never clear to me what the edge is cutting, but nonetheless, we're talking about things that are very much in our lives. When we've got the sudden eruption of the Me Too movement, and the power of it, right, to throw out powerful men out of, very prominent positions. And I don't know if I saw in the New York Times today, Chuck Close, very well-known painter, was getting his work removed from museums because he's been charged with sexual harassment. Netflix is going to, or Amazon is going to sever its connection with Woody Allen and not make his next film. So we're looking at an area in which, on Title IX legislation for universities and colleges, we're looking at areas in which we are trying to work out a good way to absorb our sexual lives, sexual wishes, wants, and needs into the rest of our social lives, which have to acknowledge the existence of power differences and authority differences and all kinds of other things. And at the moment, I think we're sort of trying to find a good way to do that. And clearly women have been exploited and disadvantaged, and now the pendulum is swinging strongly in the other direction. And we've got to see, and I don't know, it's a political and complex question as to where it will end up. Different question on the philosophical one is, where should it end up? What would be a good place for it to end up? Never mind realpolitik and where in fact it will. But yes, that's a real question, and it's raised significantly, right, in a context in which you've got younger and older put together. And you're quite right. Where is the sweet point for deciding when somebody can make a certain kind of decision? And if we have very protective attitudes to, especially women, very protective attitudes, we tend to set the age of consent quite high. And but if we look across cultures, and not just first and third world cultures, but all first world ones, we find that, for example, in Spain and Portugal, they set it earlier. And that's in part because of a recognition on their part of the sexuality of people they're looking at. They think, but they are already sexualized. They are. Right. And what we want to do is teach them and educate them, not in the sense that, no, you can't say yes or no, you're too young, but how to say yes when you mean yes and no when you mean no, and how to get that recognized by somebody else. We want, I think, a little bit simultaneously not to educate people in these things, and then have the law stuck in to punish those who go against them. And it would be better if we found good ways to educate everyone, so that that we were much more open about it, so that saying no and getting it recognized was something that you were practiced at, even when you were 14 or 15, rather than no, you're not in a position to say, seems like that's infantilizing a little bit and doesn't fully recognize the reality of sexual changes and biological changes in people. Can I put another question on the table now, and then we'll, on Wednesday, we'll start going into the details of this symposium. So a different question is one which, if you read, I think I asked you to read this paper of mine called Telling the Truth About Love. And one of the questions that's central so the symposium is the one that I explore a little bit in that paper, which is, who do we learn the truth about love from? And we looked at this a little bit last week. So lots of people claim to be